Wait for it.
And we're live.
Look at that. We're live and ready to go. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and do this. All right, everybody, and welcome back. I'm your host, Chris Allen of the Dynasty Owners Manual podcast, and we're here for the episode 14, and we have Kevin O'Brien with us of the FFEngineering pod. And Kevin, again, we want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with us. And as some of the folks on Twitter might have noticed before, just thinking about if you've seen Kevin's Twitter posts and you've seen some of the folks that he's talked to, there's a wide range of people that he's talked to. He's talked to folks within the fantasy industry. He's spoken to folks that are actually a part of the NFL, either being in the media, agents, things of that nature. So it's been it's a huge event for us in order to sit down and talk with us. So again, Kevin, thanks for taking the time. And how are you doing this evening?
Doing great, man. Kids are almost settled. Usually I record around 10 o'clock and give myself a little buffer, but with 4 kids, you try to get them all settled before we do a podcast. But tonight we just made it, maybe 5-10 minutes beforehand, and doing good, man. Feel good.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got 3 myself, so I've got 2 that just went down about a half hour ago. So I heard some rustling a little bit ago, but I think we're okay for the evening. I think so.
And, let me say, guys, real quick. So I consider myself more of a fan than an quote-unquote analyst, and that's why I started my podcast, was that I really wanted to ask the questions and interview the people that I thought weren't asking the right questions to these titans. When I have someone like Cynthia Freeland on, I want to ask her these certain questions, because I'd hear her on a podcast and I'm like, why are you asking her about that? And it's like, I really want to hit on certain topics, and I basically started it thinking as a listener, what would I want to ask her? So when you get someone like Rich Rebar, who can just, I don't know if you guys remember as kids, you're probably close to my generation, but that Micro Machines guy that was on the TV.
Yes.
Some of these guys can spit these stats so fast, and you're like, whoa, slow down, man. I'm like, I can't even write these notes fast enough, right? So then when I started my podcast, I was like, I literally, with JJ, Rich Rebar, I do it. I say, hey, slow down, stop. We're going to go back. This is my podcast. I want to slow you down. I want to hit that point real quick. So, and all this is to say, I would sit down and talk to you guys about football, whether we were recording or not. And, if we just guys that like football, and sometimes it's hard to find coworkers that you share interest with. Like, I have one buddy that's in my home league that I actually work with, but we share interest through the social media and everything else, and I just love talking about this stuff. It's awesome.
Yeah, without a doubt. And Adam, I know you can probably attest to this as well. Even though I think you're still wearing that ridiculous hat, aren't you? But regardless, I know that being a Redskins fan and whatnot, I know it's probably easy for you to find other folks that can maybe commiserate or at least talk with you about how your team's going and whatnot. But have you experienced the same thing like Kevin's talking about?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll stop and talk to anybody about football and usually get in an argument with them about it. But it's really easy to get along with Redskins fans because we're all miserable. So we all have something in common.
Yeah, I think that's the same thing. I'm from Ohio. It's either we've got the Bengals or the Browns, so you can get mad, or regardless of which Ohio team that you say that you support. So I'm kind of in the same bucket as you guys. But here we are this evening, Kevin, to really get with you and talk with you about an article for DLF that you had written quite some time ago. But I think it kind of encapsulates somewhat of the basic concepts of how you would approach building a dynasty league. Or a dynasty roster, rather. So before we get into the article itself, I wanted to at least get your take on a particular sentence that I saw in the article itself, and it talks about looking at teams in the 3 to 4 year window, and you're never trying to sacrifice the short term for the long term. So for you, is that something that when it comes to looking at that 3 to 4 year that 3 to 4 year window, do you feel that there's any shortcomings after playing Dynasty for so long? Do you think that there are any weaknesses to having that methodology?
So no, and the reason I can say no is because the way I look at windows is that they're rolling windows. They're not 3 years, then I quit the league. So when I talk about a 3-year or a 4-year window, I'm talking about a rolling window. So say in 2014 you start a league, and 2017 you don't just, it's not a hard stop. So in 2015 it's also a 3-year window. So I'm just looking at, in terms of like, in the way I put in an article and the way I reference 401k is that everyone has to do a self-evaluation. When do you expect to get paid out, right? So if you're 18 years old and starting a 401k, you've got quite a long time when you expect to actually get paid out. So you can have a longer quote unquote window. But if you're a 50-year-old guy and you just started doing your 401k, maybe you need to get paid out a little bit sooner. So I think there's a self-evaluation that happens that says, I want to play in a 3-year window where I want to get paid out. So like, for instance, one of the leagues I'm in is a $250 FFPC Dynasty league. Now, do I really want to punt year one? That's $250 down payment that I now got to punt into year two. Now that's a $500 investment, banking on my punt year one strategy is going to actually work out. Or do I want to get, the best roster I can, even 75% of the way there? Then the next year I'm even closer. So it's just a philosophy that says, when do I want to get paid out? I mean, that's, when do I want to win? When do I want to pay out? And what's my expectations for what's deemed a dynasty, right? And I think that's very important that everyone takes into account. And for the comment part of this that you mentioned is never sacrificing the short term for the long, and never sacrificing long term for short. The reason I say that is because there's a lot of characteristics that we can play with in our dynasty teams, is age, assets, etc. And something I like to do is I'll like to look at the types of assets that I have on my team. So if I say, for instance, I have Devontae Adams, Keenan Allen, and a relatively young running back, I can feel more comfortable trying to trade away my future first round rookie picks because I have a young core that's very good. So yet next year, I'm not sacrificing the long term by trading away that first round pick, because I expect those 3 young players that are my core to still sustain me as a young team going forward, right? If I had, Antonio Brown, Julio, and AJ Green were my 3 core main assets, I'm less likely to trade away my first round pick, because now I'm sacrificing the long term for the short. So do you know what I'm saying? So
right.
A lot of people on Twitter like to use these like short term, quick hitter, 10-word sentences that, oh, never trade away your first round rookie picks. Well, give me some context. What does that mean? You never will do it. I mean, like I did last year, I did things like where, like situations that I talked about where I was willing to trade away my first. I traded away my first and Alshon Jeffrey and got Keenan Allen. I was able to upgrade a position, but I didn't get old. I didn't trade. Everyone acts like you have to trade your first round pick for Fitzgerald. I don't get that mentality whatsoever.
And Adam, now turning over to you, I want to put you on the spot real quick. Is that a similar philosophy that you use whenever you're looking at your teams, like on a year-to-year basis?
Sure. I've probably been known to sacrifice a little too much to win now. Probably just trying to see that money so that I can pay for the future and, do this hobby for free. But ever since talking to Kevin for the first time, I've been trying to go through and actually line up the 401k that you're going to be learning about. And I'm learning a lot of what Kevin's talked about, in which now I'm trying to use a little bit of practical application and add my first to Doug Baldwin and try to get one of those premier young guys. I'm not sacrificing the future, as Kevin said, whatsoever. I'm actually banking on the future. But here's the thing that I wanted to add to what Kevin said is that we know Keenan Allen future barring injury, but do you know your 110's future next year? You have these really, really smart people saying the class is loaded next year, but it's still a rookie class. and they're still not guaranteed to pan out. So I actually think you're investing into that portion of your 401k way more if you're going to pair someone, hitting 30 that's not going to last maybe too much longer, like Doug Baldwin, and a first that you're not sure about. And if you're competing, as we're alluding to, your first is going to be late anyways. So I think he really hit the nail on the head there, where you're not sacrificing your future by trading that first. If anything, you're investing in your future more heavily by trading that first in that scenario.
And that's interesting because I think when the folks that I've spoken to about trading away like their first round picks, it does seem like a lot of them not necessarily advocate for trading for some of the older players or anything like that, but it does feel like at least from a 10,000-foot view, it does sound like, oh, if you're trading away your first pick, you're giving away everything. I mean, it's such a high value asset, but it's like, well, then if you're trading away a high value pick, you should be getting a high value asset in return. So the folks that you're talking about, the assets that you're talking about, Keenan Allen, the Doug Baldwins of the world, those are high value assets that can provide you production immediately. So those should be your targets we're looking for. It doesn't have to be somebody on the caliber of Larry Fitzgerald.
So I do think that sometimes what happens is the megaphone of Twitter takes over, right? Is that we shout louder against things like cancer than we do about the common flu. And what I mean by that is people are shouting, don't trade your first for Fitzgerald. They're shouting, don't do the worst trade that you can possibly make. But really, most people aren't thinking like that. That's probably 10% of the way rookie picks get traded. Guys like me or Jacob Rickroad that think about using our picks as assets and trading them away, we don't make trades like that. We don't allow ourselves or worry about those worst trades. I mean, people make bad trades. Nobody should make a bad trade. But when you think about trading your first round rookie pick, you should look at them like assets that you have categories in your team that you can deem expendable. And if that's your first round rookie pick, or if that's a young prospect, like say you want to trade Joe Mixon away, who's a young rookie last year, is still young, perspective, quote unquote, blue chip prospect, if you will, and you want to go and get someone like Golden Tate, that's fine. But in a vacuum, it sounds bad on Twitter because you've given up so much youth, and people say that philosophy is completely trading away your future. And where I want to take pause to that comment is basically, well, maybe I have Dalvin Cook, Gurley, Kareem Hunt. Maybe I have 3 young running backs and I'm trading one away to get a little bit older wide receiver. Am I really trading away in my future if I have such a young core? And I think that context really matters.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that's a great primer for kind of hopping us into your article that you wrote. And again, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the article itself, I wanted to ask about how you came up with that particular analogy, because I mean, as folks obviously know, like you yourself, like you're an engineer by trade. So looking at comparing dynasty assets to a 401k, I mean, how do you make that comparison? Like, can you explain the linkage between a dynasty roster and a 401k?
Yeah, so the way I kind of, I guess, thought about this was from a roster construction standpoint, in that a long time ago I wrote an article about trading and dynasty trading, and I was thinking in terms of what's an expendable asset and what do I want to get in return. And I started thinking in a value capital type game, and that type of process then evolved into thinking, well, I don't really like the way people are talking negative. There was this negative connotation about trading away first round rookie picks, and that it was such a bad idea. And what I really wanted to change the conversation to be was, like I discussed earlier, is that these are expendable assets, not necessarily core or main pieces of my portfolio. And I started looking at my roster like a portfolio. That eventually evolves into thinking about things like, when do I expect to get paid out, right? So this whole punt year one first year thing started making me think, well, if you're punting $5 league or a $30 league, that's fine. You're investing and you're just trying to build a team the way you want, and the $30 is just the cost of entertainment. That's fine. But that's putting an expectation that you're not really discussing, that you're not expecting a payout. You're just building a team for fun. But there's other people who play a little bit higher stakes. If it's $100 or $250, then the level of expectation of when you expect to get paid out is differently. And that philosophy started making me think that's what a 401k is. That's what our financial institutions, our personal financial portfolio is supposed to be geared towards, is that we have these knobs where we say we want to take on more risk. What's our payment? When do we expect to get paid out? Like I discussed earlier, if you're a young kid, you can take more risk. And basically, if we apply all those fundamental parts to our dynasty teams, then I also want to say that if I have 50% of my core roster is my main core, and thinking again about what's expendable, my expendable is taking risk. And in a 401k portfolio, you have these, maybe small cap, really international funds that are something you can put a low amount of money. Stocks maybe would be an example. Anything small cap. So I can put like 25% of my portfolio in what I would say is my expendable funds. That if I lost the money, it's not really going to hurt my retirement account. Just like the same thing. If I have a core 50% of my dynasty roster and I have in a 25% pool, I have my first round rookie picks. If I trade away that rookie pick, what does it mean to my foundation of my dynasty roster? So I think that's how I started tying, and it really doesn't have anything to do with engineering.
Exactly. So that's why I was trying to
I guess, fit if you're trying to make those connections, you'll find a lot of these guys that do fantasy football work, their day jobs have nothing. It's like you expect, like there's some guys out there like they do mathematical analysis for work and then they apply that to data. And I've done that a little bit too, but as far as this topic goes, it's completely off the rails.
Right.
So let's talk about your allocations a little bit. First, I just wanted to kind of touch on the fact that you mentioned you look at your players as a stock, and I've always tried to do the same thing. But to do that, you have to completely eliminate name association. For example, I love Darius Geis. Everybody knows I love him. I own him in probably 50% of the leagues. By the time the year comes around, probably own him in about 85%. But I find myself in trade talks with him time and time again with owners wanting that extra piece. Everyone knows by now that I love him. So the owners want that extra piece. Let me get that third round pick. Let me get Emmanuel Sanders. And initially, I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. Give me Darius Geis. That's not the case because he's not Darius Geis. He's a stock and he's worth what he's worth. And I'm not going to pay extra for the stock because I like the stock, because it's a company that I like. Now, if you're willing to pay a little extra because you feel like it's a company that's going to grow substantially, then sure, you can justify it that way. But if you're not, if you are paying extra because you are that adamant about getting a player, you're not looking at it as a stock, and it's not going to fit into your 401k. So when we're talking about your allocations, we talk about that core 50%. That's going to be your guys like Adam Thielen, Russell Wilson, Allen Robinson, things like that. People that you would like to say are at the peak of their performance. That's the kind that I spend the most on. So what do you do to afford these players? Because you can't just go out and grab Allen Robinson right now for cheap.
Sure. So the way I've typically built my teams is try to get as strong as a core as I can. So sometimes this is referred to as studs and duds. And, I just did a startup recently on FFPC that I had, I traded for an extra second round pick. So I got 3 early round picks where I got like Keenan, AB, and say, I think it was Julio. So something like that where I have a really strong core. And then after that, it allows me to get a little bit more youth, but that later in the draft. So I loaded up on like Dachshund, Shepherd, things like that, where I don't expect these guys to necessarily hit top 24 or top 12 type numbers right away, but maybe they're a little bit, high upside, former first round rookie pick type players that can backfill. So, and the idea is that when you have characterized your roster such that you have certain like 30-year-old guys or 25-year-old guys. So say I pair Keenan with AB, and these guys are, or at least have been the last couple of years, where guys I can get in the first round and second round, and that's not, they're not both costing you a first round startup capital. So you get AB, you get Keenan, but Keenan's still young enough where he's growing into that older premier, can be a top 5 wide receiver type asset. And the idea is that you backfill. So you can backfill with, some like Golden Tate, but then pair him with Sterling Shepard or somebody that's a little bit younger that might ascend into a wide receiver 2 type production. And the idea is that you're turning it over, right? Like think about a business that has product lines, right? You want to have the Atom 1, and then you want to be able to research the second product and have Atom 2, right? You don't want to say, put all my funds in Atom 1 and hope we just make a ton of money and then we check out. It's, you want to develop Atom 2 while you're selling Atom 1, right? And you always want to be thinking about what's going to backfill. So when the cliff comes, and it will come with all of our teams, and if you've been playing long enough, you'll have guys retire on your roster. I've been around doing Dynasty long enough where I've had players like, Matt Forte retire off my rosters, backfilled by Devontae Freeman. I got Freeman for a second round pick. He's a perfect segue as Forte was retiring off of my teams and running him into the ground, that Freeman was then picking up in the back. And, go on and on, MJD, AP, Tony Gonzalez, I've had all these guys aging off my rosters, but that doesn't mean I just turn a blind eye to where my team will be in 3 years.
Gotcha. So if I'm understanding this correctly, if we're looking at just the 50% portion of your roster, these are players that we know their situation. We have at least some historical data on that they're able to produce at a high level. So you put them in that 50% allocation, but then you notice or you track them. And as they continue to get older, I'm assuming that a player like you just mentioned, like Matt Forte, he was at some point a part of your 50% core, but then as he started to get older, work started to decline. He moved over to your 25%. Am I understanding that correctly?
Sure. Yeah, and I neglected to talk about that other 25%. So I talk about the 50% of my core, 25% is my prospect rookie picks. The other 25% is my what we would call in the, I guess, 401k terminology would be the large cap, pay up for IBM. Maybe IBM won't grow a ton, but it's known and it's going to live a life, maybe GE, something like that, where it's old school and it's going to have some return. They're going to pay out dividends and you get something from them, but you don't expect them to grow much and you don't expect them to, I guess, live that long. So, Fitzgerald, Doug Baldwin, Gore, these guys would be sitting in that 25%. And just like you just put it perfectly, is that at one time Gore was a top 12 running back for me in my core, or Forte or AP or Jamal Charles. And as soon as he started fading or getting older, even if he was producing at a high level, like Fitzgerald is a great example because he's giving you wide receiver 1 type numbers. So a high production, but low cost. And he's in your large cap fund, if you will, that 25% where you expect him to age out of the league. And, so as you constantly think about it, you're taking your players from your core, you're moving them on to the higher end, that large cup 25%, and then backfilling it with that other 25% that is your younger core, which for me was like Devontae Freeman, Keenan Allen, players like that. And you want those guys to come into your core as you're flushing out the older guys from your core.
And I want to touch on both of your 25% allocations a little bit more, but we overuse the term high ceiling. We overuse the term upside. I would just say that they're ascending players. And what we're getting at here is guys like Kenny Stills, guys like Will Fuller, they're young. So we're looking for them to eventually get into that core of players. So what specifically are you looking in the guys in that 25% that you're looking to expand?
So for prospects wise, it depends on whether I've drafted young or not. Do I have a bunch of like Devontae Parker, Sterling Shepard? Am I holding my hat on like a John Ross or Will Fuller? Who do I have in that pool that's a already on my roster player? But also, what picks do I have? So there are cases where I have teams that I do end up with multiple firsts just because I got a sweetheart deal. I mean, it happens just. If the opportunity comes, I will take on that asset. And if I have 2 first-round rookie picks, then I do try to maybe trade away a player and try to get a core. So there's different ways for those players to ascend. But generally speaking, I say all this, but I do study film. I do rank rookies. I do all that research, and I still want to hit on these players. I think Juju Schuster I got as a 112 pick in actually Chris trial by fire that you just joined my league. I got Juju at the 112 last year. I got Fuller at 111 the year before. So there's ways to be competitive and winning, and those teams have AB and older players, maybe Tate, something like that. I do have older players, but I was able to hit my rookie picks. And so I still focus on what type of picks I want, what type of players I want, and I go after those guys, no doubt. I don't just punt and look at these as straight assets. I do try to evaluate and differentiate myself. So I do target players like that. So I think that's trying to where you're going with that question, Adam.
Sure. And then the last 25% that we're talking about is almost like the aging vets, or to me, they're diamonds in the rough. What exactly are your expectations for guys like Larry Fitzgerald and Marshawn Lynch? Are you comfortable with them just, dying on the roster if it means
absolutely
winning some money?
Absolutely. I don't fear the end. One of my favorite movies as a teenager was, I think it was Marked for Death. Steven Seagal, the fear of death is worse than death itself. The fear of these players aging is worse than them aging themselves. I've had players like Forte run them into the ground. They give you, okay upside, buy filler weeks, if you will. They're still valuable to your roster, and you don't have to cut bait just to get some value. The value is winning. I mean, sometimes, we just need to kind of differentiate, and this is perfectly fine too. And I put this somewhat in my article, is that, your version of getting paid out and my version of paid out can be different. Mine might be winning or championships. Yours might be accumulating assets that you might win in the future, that your window might be 5 or 8 years out, just like a 401k. Each of our 401k is going to be a little bit different depending on your age and how much you're able to put into your 401k and how much time you put into researching the picks and the players and all this stuff. So that can be different, and that's fine. But I think it's perfectly okay to have a Fitzgerald and let them just, I call it running into the ground, like you have an old car, right? Like,
right.
It's like, do you really want to trade in for like $200 to get the new car, or just run it into the ground and then get the new car? I mean, does the $200, $500 trade in really, get you anywhere.
Right.
Just use the car and then, save a couple extra payments and then go get the new car. So to me, it's fine. The only place I would really differentiate in that opinion would be that the nature of the way I'm building my rosters, I will never have too many people in that pool. So it's really important to emphasize that that pool is 25% or less. If you're less comfortable with these aging vets and you think that you don't want to have too many, put that number at 10% of your roster. Just have a few players and let them age off. I don't want to have 40% of my roster aging out of my roster, right? That's bad. That's leveraging your short term for your long term. So, or leveraging your long term for short. So that's a key, right? Fundamentally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think so. Just a quick recap, if I'm understanding all of this correctly. So, if we want to look at full roster construction, so 50% that goes to the players again that we know that they can produce. So, like Adam had mentioned earlier, like you confirmed, Kevin. So the Russell Wilsons of the world, the Adam Thielens, the Devonta Freemans, those players that typically, if you're in redraft leagues, are going in the early rounds, like those guys that
that's a good way to put it. Yep.
So if I'm trying to link it to something else, so there's your 50%, your core players. 25% now goes to those high ceiling players. So players like Will Fuller, players like a Kenny Galladay, somebody in that realm that that if they pop, it's going to be huge, but there might be some lean weeks like somewhere in between. We're just looking for
high risk.
Absolutely. Yep. And then finally, the final 25% would be some of those aging vets that we discussed, the Marshawn Lynch's, the Larry Fitzgerald's, players of that nature. So, okay, so 50, 25, 25. All right, so that makes sense.
The only asterisk I'll put in that is that those percentages are generally how I build my rosters. And I'm perfectly okay with somebody else saying that I'm going to have that mid-core at 40% and, I'm going to screw up my math. I know it 40, 30, 30, right? So somebody can put 30. You can put more and older. Or if you want to do 40, 20, 40, and you want to build up more youth, I'm okay with that. And a long time ago, what I did was I call it opposition research. So, Adam, I think this is big for you. And there's a little bit of advice. So someone that plays the way you do, it's very important to characterize the way your opposition plays. And this took me a long time to realize in Dynasty because I probably philosophically align more with Adam, especially early on. But what I found was there are people building their teams differently than me, and I need to leverage that. So there are people that like building up a younger roster, and that's fine. And I want to leverage those people. I want to identify who they are, how they value those younger rosters, and I want to be able to target them specifically. So that's important. The other part of this is that I guess let's use the case of an orphan. So let's say you're taking on an orphan team, which is something that I know you did in Trial by Fire. You're taking on a roster and you didn't build it. So if your foundation's going to look like something that wasn't yours. Mm-hmm. And this is important because you need to now take players that you think don't fit your roster or fit your philosophy. And you want to be able to target the other owners that build differently than you that might be looking to take on those players. So let's say you're a young guy or a youth, more centric kind of player where your younger pool of players is that 40%. You're going to bet damn well that I'm going to Adam and say, hey, man, I got like Golden Tate here. You think he's pretty good. You think he can win you some money right now. Give me your first round pick. So that's a place where I'm going to target and know my owners and how they build their teams, right? So that's really important. The other part of this too that I want to mention is you want to have respect for people who evaluate players differently than you. So a long time I realized that some of these youth guys were actually failed redraft guys, that they weren't identifying the right old players. They were building even their redraft teams with bad older players, and they were getting stuck with people that were falling off in mid-season, and then they have a negative opinion of those old players. So they weren't evaluating those players correctly, and then they found a niche in how to evaluate rookies. So say, and no, with no disrespect, Adam, let's just say you don't evaluate rookies as well as you think you evaluate a Golden Tate. You can say, I see his consistency clearer than the other person. And vice versa. There's probably someone out there that says, I can pick Juju as the 12th pick in a rookie draft, but I don't know if it's Fitzgerald, Tate, or somebody else is the next Dwayne Bowe. So they themselves have to know, I can't discern, is Jeremy Maclin at the end of his career? Is Fitzgerald at the end of his career? Because those ages are different, right? They're both getting old, but I can't choose which one is which. But I can choose which one is better, Geis or Royce Freeman. And you just want to respect your opposition that they might be able to differentiate those players better. So these percentages really should move based on your own abilities.
Sure. And you brought up so many excellent points that I want to touch on real quick. First, I want to start from a different perspective. And I've talked about this on a few of our podcasts so far, is kind of like a buddy system. So not just so much finding somebody else that is, say, very young, youth-centric, but finding somebody that's in a rebuild while I'm trying to compete. So at that point, I don't have to go to them and say, well, you value youth too heavily. Well, no, maybe they're just constructing differently, in which case I would like to send them maybe some of my youth and allocate more to my core. And then, they'll send me that Golden Tate or something like that. And then also, if you are going to play the way I would like to say I do, which is just your typical win now, that's when stocks and valuing your players as stocks becomes your defense mechanism. So you really need to stop looking at names and really start looking at values in that situation, because you do get a lot of guys saying, hey, you look like you're going for the championship. Let me get your first for Golden Tate. And not saying that you never want to trade your first for Golden Tate, but I might poke around at a few other players first that might be a little younger and they're in the same tier, because I'm big on using tiers. So it all comes full circle, and that's why we do this podcast, and that's why we use practical application, because you can win now and win in the future, which is the whole reason of having you on, by just valuing your players as a stock and really protecting yourself and the way you play the game.
Sure, absolutely. I reference the Patriots all the time. I'm a Homer Patriots fan, but I look at them, you think Belichick says, Shane Vereen's getting too old, I got to cycle him out. And you say, okay, we're just going to give up, okay. Teddy Bruschi is going to retire at linebacker. All right, we're not going to draft another linebacker. We just give up. We're just going to punt and trade away Brady. We can't refill this. Vrabel's gone. Ty Law's retiring. The defense is falling apart. Let's just trade Brady. Do you think he does that? I mean, I don't understand this concept. Never give in, never keep fighting. Why would people give in and trade away all their assets? Trade away your assets and build a revolving door of your roster the way that I've described. And you really, you should never come to a point where you've got to fold the cards in because you've put all your chips in players that have retired.
Right, without a doubt. And just take a quick break real quick. I wanted to talk with you guys real quick, the folks listening on YouTube and the folks that will be listening to the podcast later, about a good friend, Addison Hayes, over at ffstatistics.com. I don't know if you guys were able to catch Addison posting over on Twitter earlier today, but he is giving away one of the draft guides for 2 QBs. So here's how you enter into the drawing. All you have to do is follow at 2QBs and also at FFstatistics_ on Twitter. and then retweet and also share the link that he has available or the tweet rather, so that other folks can see it. He'll announce the winner on Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, so be sure to go ahead and get your name in there and see if you can pick up the 2QBs guide. I know a ton of folks that were able to contribute to it. Actually, a couple of folks that we've had on the podcast before, folks like Bobby Koch, and then also, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Peter Howard also contributed as well, and a number of other fine writers. So be sure to go ahead and get your name in there, retweet, share, and do whatever it takes in order to get yourself in the drawing for that. So be very, very good in order to get that material, and also to share the great work that Addison and actually his team of writers that have also come onto the site, to get some more word out there for them. So we're looking forward to seeing how that all develops. But back to the conversation at hand.
So before you move on, I want to add on for Addison. So I got this running list of people to interview. If people aren't familiar with my podcast, please look out for it and check it out. I interview a wide range of guests, and I've been very fortunate to interview some quote unquote big hitters, right? And I have a range of guests that are quote unquote low hitters to high hitters. I want to pick from everybody. And so I have a running list of people that I want to get to interview. I have a booking that I schedule some people, and then I have a list of people that I want to get to. Addison's definitely on that list. I got hit on Twitter. Somebody said, "Yo, FFEngineer, you really got to get this guy in your pod. I want to hear all about him." And I respectfully replied, and I said, I have this running list. I want to get to him. I know he's been on a couple pods. I know he's been on you guys' pod, and he's been out there a little bit. And so I said, I want to get to him eventually. Okay, I thought it would end there. I got inundated with people asking and retweeting, favoriting to get this guy on my podcast. So he's definitely taken him by storm, and I respect the guy's work. I'm going to say this. I'm not jaded just because he's using R. So if you guys don't know, he's using R to do his website. So I'm particularly favored to people developing in R as a coder myself. And so no, he's doing great work, calling all this data together and giving it in the, I'm really big, like you guys say, practical application. I'm really big on, here's the data, but how do you use it? How do you filter it? How do you see it? How do you use it? So I'm a really big fan of Addison. He's doing great work, and people make sure that you get involved, retweet. 2QBs is awesome. I go way back with Sal. So that's great stuff anyway, but follow Addison on Twitter.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think Addison has been great. I mean, he's definitely, been working with him kind of behind the scenes to promote some of his work. And as you just mentioned, I mean, he's kind of blown up over the last month or so. So it really doesn't need much of a boost from us. But yeah, it'd be great to see you guys converse. So I really hope that you guys can make that happen. But back to our conversation. So if I could sum up real quick, the 50, 25, 25, and as you're mentioning earlier, the fact that some of those percentages can shift. In a simplistic view, would you say that if you were to shift them based off of your own personal play style, it's about accepting risk? Would that be a good way to look at it?
Sure, absolutely. Where you want to leverage your risk and how much you want to take on.
Right. So if you were able to look at that, so if you look at risk, at least in the sense of an imbalanced roster, so say if you were to take over an orphan or something like that, are you okay with acquiring certain players in order to, I guess, essentially, let's say, rebalance that roster? So if you took over an orphan and you found that the allocations were off. Let's say there was just too much. There were too many in your too many of the 25% players, or there are too many of the aging players. How would you mitigate that risk in order to get it into the roster to a state that you would be comfortable with using it?
Yeah. So the first step taking off an orphan, before I answer your question directly, the first step in taking an orphan is to find out who has the expendable players that are similar to my philosophy. So for instance, I would go out and I would look for people who accumulated younger players. So let's say I'm imbalanced in an older player pool. So say that Larry Fitzgerald, Frank Gore, that bin was too big for me, for my liking. And I would go search out for these players that are competing. They've had a really good roster, but like, say, for instance, they have too many roster spots filled with expendable players that are young rookies waiting for breakout. Years ago, Devontae Adams was a big one for me. So I took a risk on someone else's evaluation that Adams was going to break out. And I said, okay, hey, let me trade away Frank Gore or Forte or something like that. Where the 4 years ago, say 2-3 years ago, they could benefit from using that player while they were waiting out for this basically busted asset to eventually break out. And I give Jake Rickard the credit. I think he came up with it, but I have used it so much that I might just get to a point where I'm stealing it completely. But we call this the incubation period, is that there are these players getting incubated on different teams. Like Treadwell right now is getting incubated. Very likely you could see Treadwell become a Devontae Adams. He moves to a different team. Thielen falls off the map. Who knows what happens, but he's free. And this is a recent former first round rookie pick 101. He was like the top pick. I mean, this is like, are you saying all the evaluation that was done at the time is wrong? It's just completely busted. So yeah, maybe I trade Frank Gore for Treadwell. There could be a team that would do that trade. So basically, you two throwaway assets at opposite ends of the spectrum, where somebody's looking to fill in a flex play, where Treadwell is not going to fill a flex play for you right now, or a bye-week filler, if you will. Then you get him. So yes, I'm willing to take on those risks, but I'm basically making someone else take on an equal and opposite risk. Right. So that's I like to look at trades from a technician type of point of view, where I'm actually trying to find ways that, yes, I'm taking a risk, but I'm also asking my trade partner to also take a risk.
Right. And does your level of accepted risk, because as we're discussing it, we're looking at your roster as a whole. And as you just mentioned, trading, let's say, Treadwell for Gore. So that's across positions, but within a certain position. So if we're looking at just your running backs or just your wide receivers, does your level of acceptable risk change within the position itself?
Sure, absolutely. And something is if you look back, I don't think we do this enough in Dynasty communities. If you look back and you look back at what was a bad trade 2 years ago, looks like either a great trade or a mediocre trade now. I mean, there's trades that I've made that I actually stopped doing this on Twitter, to be honest, because I used to get hammered. I gave up things for Devontae Freeman I got ridiculed. People tore me apart, that I traded. You traded a first-round rookie pick for Devontae Freeman. He was a second-round rookie pick last year. He sucked his year, whatever. But I believed in him, and I put my money where my mouth is, if you will. And okay, so then I got top 5 production for a year or two. That was worth it to me. Now that trade all of a sudden looks at. So don't be afraid to fail. I mean, that to me is the worst thing you can do, is think that in the moment player evaluations are going to hold up all the way through. So never be afraid to, pick it and stick it. If I made a commitment that I like Keenan Allen over Jeffrey, that was something people looked at as a bad trade. It's not looking so bad right now, in my opinion. So, I mean, and it can go both ways, but you got to expect that variance. You got to expect you're going to hit some, lose some. I mean, you just, without doing it, and if you just fear risk, then you're never going to make any trades. And, what's that old Jordan saying? You miss all the shots you don't take, or something. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So, I mean, you got to do it. I mean, I don't fear risk at this point.
So we've just discussed trading a little bit. Now, since we've been in touch, I've done this exercise with all, I guess, close to 15 of my rosters now. So I'm going to throw you in my shoes for just a second and elaborate a little bit on this trading aspect. So let's go ahead and say that one of my rosters, which I found this to be probably 3 or 4 of my rosters and have since changed, were a little too heavily allocated in the aging vet fund. Where are you going from there?
So if I have, I mean, if you want, we could use real players. Do you have like 3 names? Give me 3 names.
Sure, yeah. Fitzgerald, LaShawn McCoy, and um, is AJ Green still in the core,
No,
or are we
yeah,
putting
I
him?
mean, he's on the threshold, right? So he's
Mhm.
probably still in your core, depending who else is sitting in your core. Like if you have Keenan and Brandon Cooks or something like that, AJ Green's probably still hanging in your core, and hopefully you have someone close that's coming up into your core that AJ Green will be moving out. But so generally speaking, depending on the age of your core as well. So like if you have, Golden Tate can be somebody that's still in your core, but isn't exactly young, right? Like a Keenan Allen could be sitting in your core, but he's young. So it depends on the overall age of your roster, but I would say generally speaking, AJ Green, someone that you could try to start to flip for somebody a little bit younger. And you might have to give up something to do that, right? But say for instance you did an aggressive move where you took AJ Green, your first round rookie pick, for Keenan Allen. I would say that'd be viewed as aggressive, and you're really putting heavy assets into Keenan Allen, but you're getting younger at the same time. So you're trading away a player that's getting older. And and to be honest, what happens is, let's make the analogy that your older players pool there is getting to be a horse pill. It's too hard to swallow. It's hurting you. It's weighing you
Sure.
down a little bit. But as soon as you make AJ Green into Keenan Allen, now that boat starts getting a little bit more even, right? Now you're not too much like this, even though you still got McCoy and Fitzgerald, which now becomes more palatable, and you've leveled off the age of your mid group. So you still do want to kind of keep those two together, and how one can help the other depending on the age of both groups. So, but those players that you mentioned, I would probably investigate trading Fitzgerald first and hold on to AJ Green. But certainly we're talking about 2 different levels of assets, right? AJ Green with something a little extra could get you Keenan Allen, but Fitzgerald, even with the first, isn't getting you Keenan Allen. So it depends on your philosophy and how much you want to build and get those marquee names. But you could probably turn Fitzgerald plus first for maybe Tyreek Hill or something like that, where they're not necessarily a marquee, or Cooks. Maybe Cooks is a better people. There's some people wavering on Cooks' value. Maybe they're looking to kind of get their assets in a such that they can go buy the next Cooks in their mind. So there's ways to do it, and it kind of depends on who's in your team, in your in your league. Who's willing to trade and what kind of players and things like that. I mean, identifying your trade partner and targeting those guys is key, right?
And then I want to use one more instance as an example, one more owner's shoes that I'm going to throw you in. And this is also a question that I ask, it seems like almost on a weekly basis now, because this is the problem that I'll run into if I won 15 out of 15 championships, which obviously you're lucky to win one. But I'm just saying, if you were trying to build your roster in such that you gave 40% to your aging vet fund, what are you doing then? So you increased your allocations to your vet fund at this point. Who cares? Screw it. I'm going for the championship. You win the championship. What do you do now? Are you going to flop 40% to now your prospects fund maybe, so that you can almost like a productive rebuild, or how are you going to go about that?
Yeah, so let's think about in terms of exposure. You've exposed yourself to potentially losing a large portion of your roster as soon as next year. Let's make it worst case scenario. Let's say you have Fitzgerald, McCoy,
Lynch.
places like Lynch, where like next year 3, 4, 5 players could be gone, and that's exposing yourself greatly. Now, I either want to have a really strong Keenan, Adams, Cooks type 3 to go with those guys, where they're still producers, they're still marquee names, they're still going to be the core of my roster even when I lose that many older players, or I want to have a little bit more balance in my youth, so that even if I have a down year, so let's say next year you kind of fall off the map, you're able to recover quicker. So it's the teams that I really worry about that have that 40% or 50% heavy age, but they've taken all of their first and second round rookie picks and completely avoided the age of the middle of the roster. So you may classify someone like Marvin Jones or Golden Tate, someone like that, where they're sitting in the middle of the core roster, but they are kind of older and they could fade out and become actually into, as you lost Fitzgerald, maybe you move Tate next year into that older player pool. So now your core is now being exposed, right? You completely, it's not just 40% next year that you're going to lose. You're also losing from your middle. So you want to make sure that you're backfilling that, right? So you want to kind of make sure that you have a steady balance on the other two, right? So think of it as like you're reaching a little bit. So say you're reaching off the boat for that fish that's just out of reach, right? And you're like, man, I really want to go after it. I really want to go after it, right? But you kind of want to anchor yourself on the other side a little bit stronger, so that when you're reaching, you don't just completely fall out, right? So then it just makes sure that you want to make those a little bit steady. And using examples, I would say this. There's a lot of people that I observe where they go win now, and they think, oh, I'll just take more flyers like Kenny Golladay, 6th, 7th round NFL draft picks like Byron Scott or Trey Quinn, and they take like these, like, let me just take a lot of flyers and penny stocks. It's like, that is not securing your other side, right? If like that analogy I said, reaching off the boat, you're basically reaching for something that has no anchor. You're not, with this other hand, you're not grabbing anything to hold on to that is full of penny stocks. That's not a good idea, right? You want to have a couple people that at least have maybe draft pedigree or something, like, even if that pool is like a box full of like John Ross, Fuller, Shepard, Treadwell, guys that have gotten a little cheaper, but at least have some draft capital to kind of sustain themselves. So if you're overexposing yourself, is I think the best way to look at it. You just want to have a little bit stronger on the other side. So maybe they're fewer players, but they're better type players.
And so does this, looking at, as we've discussed, looking at risk from a singular roster. So now let's look at your entire, I guess, dynasty portfolio. So if you're managing multiple teams, I mean, would this same overarching, theory apply to all of your teams? Like, would you look at 50%, 25-25 for all of your teams, or is it just more about, is it more towards managing risk in general for that?
So Chris, I'm going to give you a lot of kudos, man. This is a great question that nobody's really hit me on since I've had this philosophy. So I started thinking this way maybe 2-3 years ago in Dynasty and talking about it on Twitter. I think I did a Blueprint episode about it last year. And then I did the article, obviously. And this is one area that I probably play ignorance to, is that, and I'm going to do this as humble as possible, I have hit on the players that I over invested in. So I invested across all my leagues, like 20 dynasty leagues. I bought Freeman basically in every single league for 2nd and 3rd round rookie picks, and I hit. So for me, I'm not coming from a place that is probably the average, So if you overexpose yourself to a player, and I think that's where you're hitting at, is that if you overexpose yourself, say you bought Watkins everywhere and you paid up everywhere and he didn't pan out, it's like, oh crap. I didn't really experience that, to be honest. I overinvested in Keenan Allen. I overinvested in Freeman. I overinvested in Antonio Brown when people were telling me that he was a sell high. I don't follow that category. So minimizing risk is, again, this is all ties back to the same philosophy, and you got to know yourself. If you feel like you're uncomfortable exposing yourself that way, then obviously I wouldn't recommend it. But at the same time, if you feel confident in your evaluations of a player, this is like, flipping a coin. One coin has nothing to do with the next one. The fact that you took risk on a player that you believe in League A really should not impact the way you feel about Team B in a different league. If you believe in that player, why would you go against yourself? That makes no sense to me. I believe Keenan Allen, like if I did this last year and I said, oh man, I really believe in Keenan Allen, I don't think Jeffrey's going to be a top 5 receiver ever. But I go in it and I buy that variance in League B. Wow, you know what I mean? Where's the intelligence in that? I just bet against myself for no reason. Just for
Right.
what? For balancing risk? I don't get that mentality. So it's not the way I play. But I do understand the desire to feel cozy about your exposure. And so I fundamentally can understand where somebody's coming from if they want to play that way. And I fully support it if that's what you feel strongly, or like I talked about before, you got to know what you're good at. If you're good at mitigating your exposure risk, then by all means, don't overinvest in a player across the board. But at the same time, my home league is called Player Go Home. This is my philosophy in all aspects of fantasy football: DFS, redraft, best ball, dynasty. No matter what I do, Player Go Home, man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but statistically speaking, aren't you lessening your success rate anyways if you are to vary your exposure? Because then you have to hit on more players. You already did the work to hit on the first one. So I never understand when somebody approaches me in a trade and tells me that they really like a player, but they have too many shares of him. Well, if you did all the work to enjoy having that many shares and to go get that player, you're just decreasing your risk or increasing your risk, because now you have to go hit on 3 other players that you also think are the same caliber player. That doesn't make much sense to me.
Yeah, it's just it's a comfortable, like I put it, it's a psychological comfortableness about it that I think people have, that they, again, going back to, you got to know yourself. There's some people listening to this podcast that don't take this stuff seriously like we do. They're listening and it's casual entertainment for them. And the way they build their teams, say they only have 3 rosters and this is fun for them, and they bragging rights is the big deal at the home league, and they're just looking for the player to buy and things like that. And so they're not really doing all that evaluation that you talked about. They're not really feeling so strongly about players the way we do. Like, I'm picking a pool of like 5 to 10 players, and I'm like putting my flag in the ground, like,
same.
Buy Keenan Allen, buy this player, do that. Like you said, guys, buy guys. I think probably 50% or more of the people that listen to these type podcasts, especially now that we're getting closer to season and there's more people that aren't 365 degenerates like we are, they aren't necessarily putting their flag in the Keenan Allen. They're saying, oh, I heard this guy Chris and Adam talking about guys. Yeah, sure. It's like people that go to the casino and they got a quarter and they just like play a slot, like, okay, maybe I hit, right? So they're not that tied to these players like we are and the way we think about it. So we need to keep that in context and perspective too, right? So Adam, to kind of, I guess, challenge what you're saying, is that I think there's a mindset that's a little bit different than us, that is just looking to maybe build 3 different teams different ways and be able to hit one and win that way, right? And they're not really so committed to certain players.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would have to agree, because at least for me and the way that I've kind of built, again, just transitioning to redraft, the way that I've built some of my best ball teams is I've tried to vary my exposure, because again, I might be able to look at the stats and, like, because I do come at things from an analytical standpoint, again, it's my own personal doubt in some of the things that the conclusions that I've come to. So not to say that I will always vary like my exposure, because there are some players that I like. Like for instance, like we discussed earlier, like Doug Baldwin, I think he's primed for a great year this upcoming season. So I have quite a bit of exposure to Doug Baldwin and a couple other players as well. But I think when it comes to, as Kevin, as you were saying, when it comes to that general level of comfort, when it comes to building a portfolio, it does have at least, I guess, it gives you a sense of security that, okay, well, even if I have messed up somewhere along the way, or even if I have completely misstepped, this one person is not going to kill me. Like, it's not going to completely bury me, and there is some, I can expect at least a modest ROI, like after the season's completed. So there is something to that.
I've seen someone joke on Twitter about this, that they say the best way to be a dynasty analyst is to go out and get 50 teams and build them all different ways, and then quit 25 leagues that you suck at. You got 25 great rosters. Yeah. I mean, there's I think this is like the wizard behind the curtain stuff. People don't see how the sausage is made, that people get these good rosters. And sometimes it's just by people joining a lot of leagues, and you don't necessarily see what leagues they necessarily abandon, and they might build different ways and want to change that exposure. And when it doesn't work, they just abandon the league. So, I mean, that's a real thing. It happens.
Oh, without a doubt. So, Kevin, I think we're winding down for the evening. And again, we want to thank you for taking the time with us tonight. So before we get you out of here, do you have any other, I guess, last-minute tips for either new Dynasty owners, folks that are currently in it, like savvy owners that are looking forward to the 2018 season that's about to start here within the next month or so? We might have some actual football. But, I mean, what advice would you give some of the people listening?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be cliche, but have fun, man. This is like a hobby. People take this very seriously. I take it too seriously. But let me take it too seriously and you have fun. So the viewers and the people out there, have fun with it and don't take it so seriously. And I will say, if you like a player, pick a player, and don't worry so much about ADP. I think a lot of casual players take ADP too seriously, that, if you want Sony Michel on your team, and you want to root for him all year, take him around early, if you're doing a startup league, and be damn value. There is part of this that has to do with the way you play and the way you enjoy the season. And, if you're a Redskins fan and you want Geis and you want to root for him, then go pay a little bit extra and not just view it so, strict. And lose sight of the fact that this is fun, because you will burn out and you'll end up not wanting to play Dynasty or fantasy football in general. That's kind of more on the casual side of it. But if you're on the serious side of it, I would try to be careful and try to generate a filter in who you're listening to. And there's a lot of bad advice out there, right? And if you drill yourself and only listen to one podcast or one person or one type of site, if you will. It's one thing that, I'm partial to DLF, but it's one reason that as a subscriber, I was so committed to DLF, because you had people that were doing, Ryan McDowell, he's won way more Dynasty championships than I have, and he punts year one all the time. He coined it productive struggle. So that is a philosophy that you can find on DLF, but there's also people that will be like a little, maybe like me, especially years ago, or similar to Adam, is that we want to win now at all costs, and tomorrow's tomorrow. So there's different ways to play, and there's different ways to win, and there's always multiple ways to skin the cat, if you will.
Yeah, without a doubt. And Adam, before we get out of here tonight, do you have any other things for the folks or any announcements?
Sure. Yeah. So I always talk about how I'm looking at it from an actual real life money perspective. But the reason we've done this podcast and the reason that I took Kevin's idea and went and did it with every one of my rosters is because I'm worried about winning in the future too. It's also not cost efficient to win the first year to pay for the next 3, but then suck for the next 6 or whatever after that too. So it's not easy enough to just say, well, to hell with what they said. I want to win right now because Adam said that you might as well win your money. And then no, you can continue to win after you win now. And I also want to mention, please never do anything because a fantasy analyst told you to do it. Always, always, always find your own justification, even for really, really smart people. Just because Ryan told you that he thinks Alvin Kamara is RB3, will go justify that Alvin Kamara is RB3. And then, then Alvin Kamara is your RB3, not just because somebody told you that. So always go double justify almost. And then just to get us out of here, please go rate, review, subscribe. We've got the Twitter handle going. We just reached over 300 followers, so that's impressive. It's at Dynasty Manual, and we're also at Dynasty Pregame on YouTube. So we really appreciate you guys joining in, and I'm at DHH_Adam.
And I really don't think that folks need to know where you're at, Kevin, because I know you have such a massive following. But for everybody that might not know who you are,
cut that right now. I'm gonna end the call.
Everybody knows who you are. There's no way that people listening to this show would not know who you are before this. But for those people that don't, where can they find you at?
Yeah, so my podcast has a landing page, Dynasty League Football. You can find it there somewhere, but at the _FF_Engineer. And Carl has gave me a lot of crap about those underscores. Carl Savchik.
Sounds about right. That sounds about right.
Yeah, at the _FF_Engineer. You can find me there. I've got links to the podcast and everything's pretty much centralized on Twitter now for me. But the podcast is on iTunes, Stitcher, all the different formats. DLF got it out there pretty wide. So Player FM, Podbean, it's pretty much all over. So you can find.
And you had a RotoHack on latest, and who else?
Raybon was this week.
Yep.
Last week. That one kind of blew up because Evan retweeted it. But Evan Silva gives you a shout out. It gets pretty wild. But so the Raybon episode got pretty popular. That was really cool. We talked about all different types of formats. So we leveraged his sports betting and DFS acumen to talk about Dynasty and how we can leverage that and fill our bye weeks and end of the roster type players. So that was a really good pod. I had RotoHack, George Kritikos on, Travis May. Before that, Evan Silva, Cynthia Freeland, Matt Harmon. I don't want to keep name dropping, but you get an idea how different the types of people. That's the reason I want to mention those names. Is that I interviewed DFS people. Last year I did Andrew Brandt. I did Peter Jacobs, who is DFS king, high stakes DFS king. So he's, I'll pull from anybody, man. I want to interview them all.
Absolutely. I think that helps build. I mean, if you're into, I'd say not just fantasy football, but just football in general, I think you've hit almost, all the high points in terms of how you can better understand both the fantasy and actual football perspectives, for the game itself. So again, Kevin, we thank you again for coming on tonight. And for all the folks listening, either live on YouTube or picking us up on iTunes and what have you, again, we thank you guys for taking a listen to the pod, and we'll catch you guys next week.